Good evening. It's my pleasure to present to you this memorial lecture and tribute to Grenada's father of the nation, Marryshow CBE. The title of this lecture is The Distinctive Attributes of Good Leadership. As we commemorate the 133th anniversary of the birth of one of Grenada's heroes and father of the nation, Marryshow CBE, it's a fitting tribute to focus on the contributions made by this great son of the soil from his early youth till the day of his death on October 19th, 1958. It's also an opportune moment to reflect, especially in this particular year, 2020, a year with its unprecedented global pandemic, political unrest on world stages, where we're witnessing some of the most egregious acts ever perpetrated in the free world among leaders whose lack of moral compass and social responsibility will, no doubt, thwart the innocent lives of younger generations to come. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, this memorial lecture could not have come at a better time to remind us of the importance of freedom and democratic processes that enable a greater participation in that freedom for everyone. Re-examining the life of Grenada's Marryshow CBE is, in this memorial lecture, should come as a breath of fresh air, if not a healing balm, to enable a turning point from the tide of moral and spiritual degradation, inept leadership that has gripped nations once looked on as a world beacon for rights and democracy, now seem to lack the rectitude and courage to vocalise or take action against the very ills it once professed to abhor. We have witnessed regression on a phenomenal level of some of humanity's most important advancement and progress made over the last millennium in areas that are now blatantly replaced by an inculcation of immorality, misogyny, overt racism, cultural and social impropriety, outbreaks of uncontrollable violence, weak and frightened leaders who have been cowed to accept all of these, amongst the rise of white supremacy and public displays of unabashed hatred. These have been perpetrated by those who nurture psychopathic and dictatorship tendencies, kleptocracy, open and blatant cheating, lying and law-breaking, all which come as an infatuation of a myth that naked individualism is to be revered over social and welfare responsibilities to the vulnerable and disadvantaged in society. Ladies and gentlemen, these are now being projected as preferred qualities of a national identity, with the humiliating indignity that it has inflicted on democratic society does really beg a belief in the 21st century. Arguably, such deformities and corruptions of this obscene model in society seems to be getting worse. And it is such a time as this that we must be mindful, albeit become vocal, in reminding ourselves of the part played in the past and the present by those who regard peacekeeping, human decency, a commitment to political freedom, frankness, and the rich legacy of stalwarts who have fought long and hard in order that succeeding generations will earn the right to maintain social and political justice in a progressive society. Ladies and gentlemen, in honouring T.A. Marryshow CBE of Grenada today, it is hoped that his legacy will once again remind and ignite a passion in us to hold on to ideals of good, societal governance, adherence to constitutional advancement, as was in Grenada's case, which resulted in representative government and federation of the British West Indies. Such a leader existed, a man who used his skills and talents to enlighten the masses of yesteryear, whose role model I now suggest today may assist societies that need to stem the tidal waves of social, intellectual, moral, and spiritual bankruptcy. It was this same belief that I held 19 years ago today, when I had gathered a team together to mark the first ever Marryshow Day in the United Kingdom in 2001, some 9 years before Grenada officially declared T.A. Marryshow Day for the island in 2010. Ladies and gentlemen, it was my belief then, in 2001, that strategic ways must be sought to assist Caribbean heritage children in the UK, many of whom I had taught for nearly a decade, to become acquainted with knowledge of their history. And that was in order to defy the stigma of high levels of underachievement among them in British educational establishments, which dogged them and many of their parents before them. The fact is, a sense of knowledge of immediate past history of the Caribbean was not accessible to them. This was a time when education was more dominated by European histories and cultures, with a total exclusion of our own histories, and many not understanding the importance of the Caribbean as the immediate past in their history, clamored for things Afro-American and African each year during Black History Month in the UK. Therefore, in trying to raise their self-esteem, tackle the disproportionate levels of underachievement, and awaken my own students' racial consciousness to progress, I took the responsibility to firstly enable that process for them and succeeding generations by instigating structures that would permanently document and make accessible Caribbean past historical role models in the UK. I therefore sought backing from the then High Commissioner for Grenada in London, Miss Ruth Elizabeth Rouse, as well as the blessing of the Honourable Prime Minister of Grenada, Dr. Keith Mitchell, and flew over from Grenada to witness the historic event, Brian Marryshow, T.A. Marryshow's grandson, and a small gathering in a school in West London to participate in my initiative. We hailed the Marryshow Day in the UK officially written into the fabric of British society on the 7th of November 2001. Today, in presenting this memorial lecture on Grenada's T.A. Marryshow CBE, I still hold the belief that, as stated by one writer, a people without a history, meaning an acknowledged one, is condemned to repeat, and equally, a people without a vision is doomed to perish. Moreover, another aim of this memorial lecture is tied up with a sense of responsibility from succeeding generations to enable a process of knowledge sharing, lest we forget our origin and the purpose of our existence. I strongly believe that the exemplar provided by Theophilus Albert Marryshow CBE, a legend of Grenadian / Caribbean politics, trade unionism, and regional integration, can shine like a beacon for 21st century societies that are engulfed in perverse political and social unjust measures that threaten to drag the rest of the world in their wake. Let me say at the outset that the historical context of Marryshow's Grenada in the West Indies was a British Crown colony in the West Indies or Caribbean region, governed by British administrators. Given the islands of the region's lack of independence to determine their own futures, the struggles for regional unity, for self-government, and trying to free themselves from the British government's colonial stranglehold was always going to be a nationalistic goal, if not a regional ambition. Clarification is also needed here with reference to the name of the islands that were first referred to as the West Indies. Although the dominant labeling of Marryshow's 19th century geographical location was referred to as the West Indies, today, in the 21st century, with numerous movements that have awakened people's social and historical consciousness in the intervening period, not to mention debunking Columbus's label of West Indies, the word Caribbean is popularly used nowadays instead of West Indies. And of course, the Caribbean defined as a region that consists of the Caribbean Sea, its islands, including the West Indies, and the surrounding coasts. Therefore, same place, but a different emphasis on naming. So we honour a great statesman today. Theophilus Albert Marryshow CBE was born in 1887 in St. George's, the capital of Grenada, to a family of devout Christians. There was nothing extraordinary about his birth, coming from a very poor family, but we're able to chart his life from his very humble beginnings to his exemplary self-taught principles and an inculcated fighting tradition to overcome imperialist stranglehold on the colonized West Indies. That makes him an outstanding bridge builder of nations and a statesman of the highest caliber. As a small boy, he lived on Lucas Street in St. George's and attended the local Wesleyan primary school. His parents were very poor and prevented him from going to school beyond primary stage. He learned to read with no electricity, no money to buy books, no access to libraries, bookshops, or museums, and certainly no private tutors. He was, however, interested in reading and became an avid reader. Like many other great men, he educated himself and developed his brilliance from his interaction with his people on Grenada's streets. Those who knew Marryshow remembered him as a man of brown complexion, average height and weight, who walked with a parrot-toe gait, tall in stature, and who always dressed elegantly in a vicuña suit and polka dot tie. He made himself a familiar sight in political circles with his charm and eloquence that always assured people of a warm welcome. He spent his boyhood years in St. George's in a district known as Tantine. This area was a familiar playground for children where the young Marryshow and his friends did the normal young boys stunts. Trapped doves, caught crabs, stole plums and sugar apples. He was a typically high-spirited boy and was popular with everyone. After he dropped out of school, he became an apprentice to a carpenter, W. Dora Phillip, for a short period. Afterwards, he was apprenticed to a printer as a newsboy and later became a reporter. During this time, Marryshow met a man who greatly influenced his life, an Irish-born William Galway Donovan, a fearless journalist at the time, an editor of The Federalist and Grenada People. Now, Donovan had a great influence on Marryshow. He was an ardent supporter of West Indian Federation, dreamt and preached federation, and the motto of his paper was, "A naked freeman is nobler than a gilded slave." His paper enjoyed a wide circulation in Grenada, Trinidad, St. Vincent and St. Lucia. Donovan passed on his enthusiasm and wisdom to the young Marryshow, and it was under the discipleship of such a steely character that the young Marryshow was determined to rise far greater than his mentor. His association with Donovan further stimulated a deep love for literature, and Marryshow's poem, which later appeared in the West Indian newspaper under the pen name Max T. Golden, was highly praised in the region's literary circles. Marryshow relished good literature and was familiar with the works of the world's most famous poets. In fact, he often embellished his oratory with quotations from these writers. But Marryshow, affectionately known as Sir T.A., was also a humanist. He believed in the dignity and equality of all people, irrespective of their colour, their race or creed. And during the 12th anniversary celebrations of his election to the Legislative Council on March 13, 1950, he said, "From earliest times, I had thought in terms of human dignity, that a man, no matter how poor, could lift himself and become somebody in the world." This is evident that he realized early on in his youth that racial and social inequalities was something that had to be fought. He said once, quote, "I never did believe, nor do I now, that Providence ordained one set of men spurred to ride and others saddled to be ridden. And this seems to have had a most profound effect and influence on Marryshow. Noting how inequality can be inculcated psychologically, he also objected to the church making people sing the hymn, quote, "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and order their estate," unquote. In fact, T.A. Marryshow's humanism was reflected in his preoccupation with the greatness of African civilization, including its cultural enlightenment. He realized too that the Indian, Chinese, and European had all contributed to the development of the Caribbean region. The fact that 99% of the West Indian peoples were expatriates and were no longer purely African, Chinese, Indian, or European, but West Indians. His view was that they must have an equal opportunity in the West Indies. Marryshow was also a poet, and it is said that his work was more fertile than Sir Derek Walcott, Philip Sherlock, A.J. Seymour, and Aed Frau, to name a few noted West Indian poets, have produced. His works depicted the fight for political advancement by West Indians and the suffering of the Negro in America. His poem, The Lynching of a Negro, took America by storm. And in a review, County Cullen, who wrote The Black Prince, said of Marryshow's work that it was better than County's own work, as well as that of other poets. But I believe he would be remembered most for his poem, The Bridge Builder, that sums up his sacrifice and commitment to young Grenadians. During Marryshow's teens, an intellectual atmosphere pervaded Grenada, and men educated in English universities in the UK returned home. Being a natural leader, Marryshow gathered these men around him and was instrumental in forming the Grenada Literary League in the early 1890s. It was in this grouping that Marryshow debated, wrote, and spoke, so that by the age of 18, he had written many articles in the Federalist and the Grenada People newspapers. However, his love of poetry identified yet another outstanding quality of this nobleman. In 1909, at the age of 22, Marryshow became editor of the St. George's Chronicle and Grenada Gazette, which at that time was the oldest paper in the West Indies. A testimony to the speed at which he learns and imbues knowledge shows in his great feat. Within only 4 years, Marryshow founded his own newspaper, The West Indian, in which he served as editor for almost 2 decades. An influential figure by then, Marryshow was both feared and respected as a leading journalist in the British West Indies. He used his paper to condemn acts of social injustice, and when he felt that criticism was justified, he did so fearlessly, including even the British administration and the governor alike. But Marryshow's main concern was to press home convincing arguments in favour of federation or a united Caribbean, as well as the abolition of crown colony rule in the region. The slogan of his renowned daily newspaper was, "The West Indies must be West Indian," which became the watchword of his fighting life. Although there were other great newspapers and newspaper editors too throughout the West Indies, Marryshow's newspaper towered above them, hence the title Prince of West Indian Journalists. And still in this period of 1910, Marryshow was also seen as a skillful debater. He was an active member of the Grenada Literary and Debating Club, as I've said, and it was where he developed his talent to communicate. He became a first-class debater with a classy reputation as a speaker and a writer. In one article, he wrote, quote, "A West Indies is a world like this, must unite and or perish." And he believed, quote, "We must think nobly, nationally, with special regard for the first fundamentals of a West Indian unity and a West Indian identity," unquote. So he was a most versatile orator, a master raconteur. He demonstrated his linguistic prowess by ranging between Standard English to the Creole vernacular with great fluidity. Marryshow has been compared to the great Abraham Lincoln, who also did not have a formal college or university education, but towered above his educated contemporaries with linguistic excellence. Marryshow travelled around the West Indies, where he met and talked with other leaders about federation. In 1917, during World War I, he wrote a vicious attack on General Jan Christian Smuts about South Africa's emerging apartheid system at a time when there was no supporters from independent African states to shield him, no United Nations, a time when there was no worldwide movements against apartheid. And during this time, you have to remember that Marryshow would have greatly exposed himself to untold repercussions as his criticisms were levelled against Smuts, a white South African ally of the British ruling empire. Marryshow's fearless words, documented in his collection Cycles of Civilization, were in defense of the millions of people who were dying in the 1914-1918 war. Yet, his lone voice for justice, all the way from what may have seemed to many like a colonial outpost in the tiny island of Grenada, perhaps obscured to the world, showed that he was undeterred in his fight for truth and justice. He was a Grenadian bent on eradicating all things inhumane, racist, and oppressive. Qualities which prove that his commitment was not only to the Caribbean region, but for humanity in general. Whereas General Smuts, the South African, believed in the supremacy of the white race, Marryshow believed in the equality of all races. As a visionary, Marryshow demonstrated an uncanny insight into 20th century conflict and its impact on civilization. In 1917, when Lenin ordered Russia's ancient orders to be torn down, Marryshow's prophetic wisdom that Africa would follow suit did not go amiss. He predicted a similar route to freedom for Africa, which, he said, would follow a redistribution of opportunities, rights, and privileges as a path to reclamation of the continent. Ladies and gentlemen, this prophetic vision articulated in 1917, is a reality today in Mozambique, Angola, Libya, Zimbabwe, Cuba, Guinea-Bissau, and South Africa. Struggling and mitigating on others' behalf made Marryshow not only a man of the Caribbean, but also a man of the world. He was against parochialism and struggled to unite the Caribbean as one, instead of tribal politics that projected one territory above the other. T.A. Marryshow was a leader in the fight for representative government, which had been abolished since 1877. In the early 1910s, he founded the Grenada Workers' Federation, Grenada Workers' Association, and wrote for it a battle hymn entitled "Vote Every Man and Neighbour." And this led to other islands in the Caribbean forming similar associations. Marryshow was in the fight for representative and responsible government long before Manley of Jamaica and Adams of Barbados. Those who joined him in the fight were Captain Cipriani of Trinidad, E.A. Rowell of Dominica, A.R. Webster of Guyana, and George McIntosh of St. Vincent. But by far the greatest vision of a united Caribbean was via federation. Federation had always been a dream of some West Indians. His great mentor, William Donovan, had preached federation. A Jamaican, Makeley, published a book on federation. Thomas Edmund Pascoe, a Grenadian of outstanding ability, a writer and poet, wrote a West Indian anthem called "God Bless the West Indies." All these men preached federation, but Marryshow made it a living issue. He used the press, public meetings, poetry and legislative council meetings to galvanize support. Interestingly, he described himself as a West Indian and not a Grenadian. Marryshow moved swiftly to encourage the setting up of his country's own legislative government by stimulating dialogue on the need for representative democracy. Of course, by the mid-1920s, his efforts had borne fruit. The first elections for membership of the Legislative Council were held in 1925, and in response to a requisition by a number of citizens, Marryshow consented to serve and was elected unanimously by popular vote. It was indeed a fitting accolade for one who had played so important a role in securing democracy for his country. Marryshow retained his seat for an unbroken period of 33 years. This was a record for any parliamentary representative in the British Commonwealth at the time, and it was marked by a specially convened session of the legislature to mark that occasion. This tireless son of Grenada's soil used every opportunity to achieve his regional integration ambition, and World War I gave Marryshow an opportunity to serve in the war effort. He was undoubtedly the first to advocate the formation of a British West Indies regiment, but that was to be a means to an end. He conceived the idea that through common sacrifice on the battlefield, the West Indies could later claim the rights of freedom, meaning the creation of a West Indian Federation. But Lord Kitchener and the War Office turned down Marryshow's suggestion of a British West Indies regiment in 1914. However, persistence on the part of Marryshow and the then governor of the Windward Islands, Sir George Basil Hayden Smith, met its reward. In September 1915, the first contingent of the British West Indies Regiment left the Caribbean for England, followed in November of the same year by a second contingent. Later, the first battalions of the regiment were transferred to Egypt, where, as well as in Palestine and East Africa, France and Italy, the sons of the Caribbean were involved in active service alongside British soldiers and others from the rest of Europe. Between 1914 and 18, Marryshow was Britain's greatest recruiting sergeant in the West Indies. He exhorted West Indians to make their own contribution, including self-sacrifice, for world democracy. His next campaign was to procure for the British West Indies some measure of democracy, and to that end, in 1917, he founded the Grenada Representative Government Association. Immediately after World War I, Marryshow organised a monster petition praying for representative government for the colony, and afterwards proceeded to England using his own money as a one-man delegation from Grenada to press the claim. During this time, legislative councils of the Caribbean islands, except Barbados and Jamaica, were appointed by their British governors on the island. But Marryshow's determination to go to the seat of empire and to make his requests known was expected to be an impossible feat, since at that time interviews with the Secretary of State were difficult to obtain. Moreover, there was no intention on the British part to hand over power to the colonies. But T.A. Marryshow CBE, our elder statesman, using his eloquence that had made men fearful of his oratory, secured an audience and set out his arguments through logical reasoning and verbal acuity, spoke not just for Grenada, but for the whole Caribbean. As a result of his persuasion, the Secretary of State for the Colonies appointed the Wood Commission, led by G.L. Wood, who was Under Secretary of State for the Colonies, to visit the West Indies to inquire into constitutional reforms. The report of the Wood Commission was favourable, and as a result, Grenada and the rest of the Windward Islands and Leeward Islands and Trinidad secured representative government. This meant that for the first time since the abolition of the House of Assembly in 1876, Grenadians were permitted to choose 5 members of the council. Ladies and gentlemen, for the first time in our history, T.A. Marryshow CBE had similarly lit a match for democracy and initiated the process of freedom from British imperialism for the Caribbean region. It was also a move which signaled the possibility of his noble vision of uniting the Caribbean islands under one federated banner. Marryshow led campaigns in all the West Indian colonies with the object of West Indian unity. He was awarded by the Queen in 1944 with a CBE medal, the Commander of the Order of the British Empire, for public services rendered to the West Indies. He was before that an official representative of the coronation of Her Majesty in Westminster Abbey. Marryshow travelled widely in the USA and in Europe. He served as the first Deputy President of Grenada Legislative Council, 1951 to 1954, and member of the Executive Council, 1942 to 54. He sat as elected member of the capital town of St. George's since the inauguration of the new Legislative Council with elected members in 1925. His unbroken period of service, 30 years in the same seat, constituted a parliamentary record for the Dominions and Empire. Marryshow has been referred to in influential quarters in Britain as the elder statesman of the West Indies. His efforts and sacrifices on behalf of federation and representation are well known. Marryshow was the most popular colonial politician in the British West Indies. He strongly advocated West Indian unity. He maintained considerable links with every Secretary and Under-Secretary of State for the colonies from 1921 until his death in 1958. This great Caribbean integrationist lived for 73 years and died on the 19th of October 1958, the same year that West Indian Federation was achieved. His distinguished life was marked by large numbers of Grenadians who would line the street or flock to their windows to pay their respects. Federation was achieved in 1958, but sadly, this collapsed in 1962. It gave rise to the Caribbean Free Trade Association, which is called CARIFTA, and later CARICOM, or the Caribbean Community and Common Market Council. CARICOM was inaugurated with the signing of the Treaty of Chaguanas in Port of Spain, Trinidad, in 1973, and exists today. In retrospect, T.A. Marryshow's clamour for political independence was taken on forcibly by other leaders, such as Sir John Compton of St. Lucia, Sir Eric Matthew Gary of Grenada, Forbes Burnham and Dr. Cheddi Jagan of Guyana, Sir Alexander Bustamante of Jamaica, Albert Gomez and Dr. Williams of Trinidad, Sir Webster from Anguilla, and Errol W. Barrow from Barbados, to name a few. This demonstrated the justification for self-government and representative democracy, fundamental but universal principles T.A. Marryshow believed, and he fought for them. Today, several institutions attest to his remarkable legacy, one of which is his former residence, the Rosary, now called Marryshow House, a national monument. It is also an extramural department of the University of the West Indies in Grenada. So, in honouring and remembering T.A. Marryshow CBE's life, we reflect on an ordinary man, coming from an ordinary background, whose life exemplified extraordinary qualities. A poor boy from a working class background in Tantine, St. George's, becoming one of the greatest voices of unity, a bridge builder of nations, a humanist, and one of the greatest journalists and poets of his age, whose poetry, it was said, was compared to the African-American Paul Laurence Dunbar. He became the founder of Grenada's first labour movement due to his gold standard of integrity and inspirational principles in the fight for justice and human progress within and beyond the Caribbean. These qualities demonstrate one of the greatest personalities the Caribbean has ever produced in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, with my belief 19 years ago that special efforts had to be made to educate young Caribbean peoples in the diaspora in the UK of the need to raise their self-esteem and widen participation in their own historical and educational developments, comes that same belief today, that celebrating the memory and examples left by T.A. Marryshow CBE, who led the way for other inspirational men and women of the past, whose exemplary qualities of greatness, commitment to nation building, bridging the gaps between racial groups and nations, commitment to peace, and fight against tyranny in our world is an imperative. Such exemplary qualities have stood the test of time and should continue to be emulated in order to curtail further demise of what we are witnessing in our world today. So I therefore end this memorial lecture with a further belief that by looking at such outstanding Caribbean role models, not only Caribbean peoples, but global citizens will appreciate their own heritage and understand the value of this for their future development, as well as the need to defend their democratic principles in our current volatile 21st century. It is a fact that we owe it to ourselves and our region to honor with dignity and pride champions such as Theophilus Albert Marryshow CBE, whose contribution to Caribbean unity and universal freedom has made us richer in consciousness and vitality. And in saluting him, I end this memorial lecture. Thank you for listening.